So I'm going to give you a run through of some various material around measuring and managing heart disease and other chronic disease. Firstly, I have a disclosure. I just love KetoFest. And by extension, I guess that means I love Carl and Richard as well. So anyway, we'll move on. My actual disclosure, my other one, is I am now working on behalf of IHDA, Irish Heart Disease Awareness, a charity David Bobbitt set up, and I'm going to tell his brief story shortly. But we have no financial ties to the heart imaging industry, though I will be talking about an amazing scan that would benefit that industry, I guess. So I'm going to go through 5 parts, hopefully not too long and tiresome. And the first is measuring it. And we say in engineering, if you don't measure it, it don't get fixed. So it's crucial you measure the correct things that apply to disease or apply to risk, not get distracted with lesser measures. So a contrast between the airline industry world and the heart disease kind of prevention or repair world. And there's big contrasts. And one of them is, and I'm actually going to look at this screen here, the best scanning technology is always deployed in the airline crash investigation, right? You need to have the best scanning, quickly identify problems with materials, and get root cause. Whereas we have an amazing scanning technology in the cardiovascular industry, but it's grossly underused. So that's a distinction. The other thing is massive research effort goes into air crash investigation, incredibly meticulous root cause investigation to identify all causes, and there are usually many that come together synergistically. And they've reduced the deaths in air crashes by a factor of 60 in the last few decades in the face of increasing complexity. However, in the heart disease kind of business, there's more focus on mitigating or band-aiding the problems and trying to kind of lower the issues. And we know that the results are nowhere near a 60x improvement, right? In fact, obesity, diabetes, and heart disease morbidity has actually been rising. And another distinction is, and I probably touched on it already, you must find root cause in the airline industry, because your financial success, it's an imperative. You cannot just band-aid over the issues. You must find cause, eliminate it to compete with competitors. But in the medical industry, ironically, it's not a conspiracy. If you don't really go after root cause and you go after expensive solutions and band-aids and repair processes, you're successful. So the money works the opposite direction. I'm going to introduce Pareto, an amazing figure, an historical figure, and he identified the principle that 20% of the effort in any endeavor, the top 20% of the right stuff to work on, gives you 80% of the results. And likewise, 80% of your effort can be spent and only get 20% of actual results. So the Pareto principle applies to nearly all systems, right? Everything has a power law. So we're going to touch on this throughout the talk. And I would say 20% of the root causes in a multifactorial issue will kind of line up with 80% of the potential fixes you can apply to that issue. So it's very important to focus on the 20% that matters. So here's David Bobbitt, my boss essentially now, his story. And he is CEO and owner of a $700 million business, right? Majority shareholder. He was 52 years old 6 years ago. He has 6 children. He's extremely focused on health, jogging 4 times a week, slim as a whippet. And he was described by all of his docs, good docs, as bulletproof. He had many executive medicals, top range. He got treadmill tests, ECGs, stress tests, all the best gear, right? All the bloods. And he was told he was the fittest 10% for his age. Bulletproof. Then he happens to get a calcium scan in the US. Complete coincidence, because he's a low-risk person in Framingham Risk. He's 5%. Usually he wouldn't get one. And it turns out he has a 906. So he's actually, in this proper, amazing scan, the worst 1% for his age for heart disease. He has a 50 to 70% chance of a heart attack or death in the following 10 years, not 5%, because CAC supersedes all tests. The angio he had to get afterwards showed 3 majorly blocked arteries out of 4, right? Massive heart disease. But he realized that you didn't need surgery in his case. He got some really good advice, and it was just lifestyle and meds, because stenting does not really prolong life or stop a further heart attack. It only alleviates symptoms in many cases. And he began to study this field intensively. He found out a few weeks later that he was diabetic, undiagnosed. His blood glucose after a meal was going up to 300 milligrams and more, right? So they missed that too, which made him very angry. And he discovered that heart disease is resolvable, even if you have really high levels like him, and that nutrition is the primary root cause you have to fix across many vectors. So he got involved in philanthropy. He has a burning desire to save people like him and the millions out there who could get a scan and wake up and find out that they're highly diseased and do something about it. And he put a couple of $1 million into the Widowmaker movie to tell the story. And that's available. We can send you a link afterwards. And it's all philanthropy, all philanthropy. So I'll just show you this calcification scan, this kind of super measure. And it's a very quick 5-minute scan, maybe $100, $150. And it's a high-speed X-ray. And as you can see here, Jeff Gerber, who you saw earlier, has no calcium in his coronary arteries. So that's what you would call nowadays a 15-year warranty at middle age. Your death rates are so low in the following 15 years, not zero, it's not perfect, so low that it's called a warranty. And this zero may be one reason why Jeff is so strikingly handsome, but I'm not sure though. So on the right, we have a very different story. This guy has a high score, maybe several hundred, and you can see the calcium there that's built up, which is a physiological defense mechanism. In areas of inflamed arteries that could be prone to a plaque rupture, calcium is recruited in and shores up that area. So it's not the calcium that's a problem per se, it's the canary in the coal mine that tells you have major disease in the preceding years, leading to the need for calcium to be built. Some quick stats, I won't go on too long. This great study recently, 2015. If you have a zero, as I said, extremely low event rates in the following 15 years, or 10 years, I think here, around 1%. And some of those will be other reasons for heart attacks, not even atherosclerosis. And then if you go down to a very high score, in this study, 37%. So that's a kind of a 25 times multiplier of risk, right? Blood pressure being high might be a 2x risk. This is 25x. So naturally, that's a Pareto measurement, right? Because you're putting in very little investment of time or effort, and you're getting a massive feedback in data, okay? It's kind of a super Pareto, like 99-1. Another quick one here, I like this study, and we can see people, 50,000 people tracked, people with no risk factors, 1, 2, or 3. And this is mortality, the big game, right? This is not soft endpoints that Nadia referred to earlier. This is mortality. So you can see that there's an increased mortality over the course of the study with more risk factors, and that makes sense. It's not massively changed with more risk factors, but it's certainly there. But what are these bars? Well, the bars are that they all got a calcification score, and hopefully you can see that it dominates way over the risk factors. Whether you have 0, 1, 2, or 3 or more, the calcification score being high predicts the mortality with incredible precision, right? That's why it's a super scan. And again, it's Pareto, but more like 99-1 rather than 80-20, okay? Let's move to another type of measure you could try and predict your heart disease with, LDL, and everyone knows the bad cholesterol. And I kind of feel sorry for LDL today because Dave, Siobhan, Nadir are just knocking the hell out of that poor guy. But anyway, I couldn't change my slides. So LDL here you can see in this study, the Nixdorf, from low CAC people, moderate, high, very high, or super high CAC, really diseased. The LDL kind of predicts a bit higher calcification and atherosclerosis, and then up here, lower LDL lines up with the really bad guys. So engineers could never use this measurement because this guy here has the same LDL as this guy here, and one of them has massive disease, and one of them has the lowest disease you can have. So how do you know what the LDL is telling you? And that's a challenge. LDL doesn't mean nothing. It can rise and indicate problems, but it's weak. If we look in the same study at what does predict in a linear dose-response relationship, we've got blood pressure, hypertension. We've got diabetes almost exponentially predicting the higher disease, and that makes sense. And I'll talk a bit about that. And one thing is both these measures speak more to true root causes, dominant ones, because blood pressure is an indication very strongly of hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistance. And diabetes, of course, is hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, type 2. And again, these are Pareto measurements. They're the percentage of measurements that tell you most of the story. So they're way more important to focus on. Now, we're going to go away from Pareto for a moment to her Dr. Professor Karl Popper, a brilliant figure of analyzing scientific method and approach. And one thing he is credited with is highlighting that a negative piece of evidence is far more powerful than many, many positive pieces of evidence. So if I say that blood pressure drives heart disease, I can gather loads of data to show that. But if someone shows me a low blood pressure situation, right, or a high blood pressure situation with no heart disease, that's a conflicting piece of evidence, and you need to reassess your hypothesis. So Popper was a great guy. So he came to me in a dream a while back and told me to look at these studies, right? And blast from the past. But here we have a study illustrative of British middle-aged men and heart disease risk against HDL and ApoB, because ApoB or LDLP is the super LDL. It's accepted to be way more accurate as a risk measure than old-fashioned LDL. So as you can see here, and it's not too surprising, high HDL people, right, who have low ApoB are the lowest risk from all of the group, right? They're the lowest. That's okay. And if you have low HDL or if you have high ApoB, in either case, you've got around a 4x risk. And that's okay too. That's a substantial hazard ratio. If you have low HDL and high ApoB, you've got an 8.7x risk in this study, right? And that makes sense too. You've got both bad risk markers, right? So they're synergistic almost. But here's where Popper came in and whispered to me. He said, Ivor, look to the Katavans. So the Katavan population is studied specifically because they have ultra-low heart disease. Teams have gone there because they're so low in heart disease. They say, hey, let's measure these guys. What are they doing? Okay? But when you look at their HDL and ApoB, they've got low HDL down around 1, men and women, and 80% of them smoke as well, which makes it even more interesting. And they are in the high ApoB group on average. So technically, they should have a huge risk for heart disease, but we know that they're probably lower than this bar. So that's an order of magnitude disparity. So you'd have to ask, wow, ApoB and HDL are totally fallible? And these guys, they're humans, you know, they're not genetic mutants. But you need to look at, well, what else is going on with them that could explain this? And as you can see, they have ultra-low insulin levels, incredibly low, and they don't rise with age like in Europe. They have ultra-low blood glucose. They have no diabetic physiology whatsoever versus 2/3 of adults in the US. They have great omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and they have no hypertension, and hypertension doesn't rise with age like it does in the Western world. So they're obviously doing some really good stuff to give them all of this. And that enables them to completely buck the trend. So this is a major black swan against the primary causal power of HDL low or high ApoB, right? They've done a Popper on it, if you will. And essentially, it's not indexing. Yeah, the outcome of the study was, or in other studies, they said it's been argued that maybe these people are genetically different. But there are great papers, and you can see the list of references there, showing that indigenous peoples, when they move to the West and they take up our lifestyle, they end up as bad as us, or worse, generally, for diseases. And when they move back to their environment, they actually begin to recover again. So I think that's a poor attack on this black swan. So be careful with measures unless they're bona fide directly connected to root cause with no black swans. So part two, the primary Paretos, let's look a little closer at some of the important things. And we've probably all seen over the years that the media and all the kind of stuff you see coming out, they're talking about cholesterol for decades, exercise, salt is bad, fat's bad, healthy whole grains you should eat, wherever they got that one, and meat will give you cancer is one of the latest kind of amusing little things coming out. But all these reports come out, but what are they missing? And what they're missing is the poor old elephant in the room, right? And this was what Pareto would not miss, hyperinsulinemic syndrome. So let's talk a bit about that. And they're certainly missing one other thing, and that is Pareto himself. If they had any sense, they'd look at all the data from the literature and rack and stack and see what's important to tell people. But they don't. So here's a study, relationship of insulin resistance, right, to coronary risk. And these guys looked through all the papers from the last 50 years and said, what are the most important variables to look at for future heart attacks? And what they saw was that hyperinsulin or insulin resistance, if you got that normal for people at a young age, 42% of heart attacks in the future could be removed. And they weren't even using the best measures. That's a big amount. And what they didn't realize or call out is that systolic blood pressure, low HDL, and BMI to an extent are all intimately tied in with insulin problems. So you can nearly look at all these numbers as a block, right? That's a huge Pareto item, right, to go after. It accounts for all that heart disease. And that's a major Pareto approach, to pick a hyperinsulin and go after it hard. Now, LDL cholesterol, the poster child for decades for heart disease risk, had a 16, maybe a 16% of heart attacks relating to it. But I've halved that, at least, because LDL as a marker predicting heart disease is influenced heavily by insulin also and metabolic syndrome. So you can't even give LDL the full credit for that number. Right? And in which case, if you had people, and we have, focusing on LDL exclusively almost for decades, what principle are they following? What guy are they following? Right? That guy? I don't know. I've been looking at this stuff for years and I still haven't worked it out, but they obviously had some leaders who led them down that path. So let's play a Pareto game. We'll go back to old Pareto and we look at the factors in this study for repeat heart attacks. So this was males who had a heart attack, and many years later they were tracked as to who had a repeat heart attack, and they measured all their variables. So we have hypertension, diastolic blood pressure, total cholesterol, and LDL. So do people think these had a big risk ratio to have a second heart attack if they were high? 2x would be a reasonable multiplier, double your risk. Let's take a look. Hypertension and diastolic, not too bad, near enough to and significant. But as in many other studies, total cholesterol and LDL, very weak showing. Okay? In the multivariate analysis, they actually analyze and they try and find out what are independent drivers and what are dependent. So I mentioned LDL can be dependent on insulin, so it's not really independent. So here's what they got in the analysis. Total cholesterol and LDL fell away as any relevance to getting future heart attacks. And insulin, what do people think for insulin? Will it get a 2x multiplier of future risk of second heart attack? 3x? You're cheating. No, congratulations. Very good. So there are many studies like this, and the Helsinki's policeman study is similar, that just show up insulin is far more important. It's not the only factor, I'll show you soon, but it's really important. And they, of course, called out that hyperinsulinism was a huge factor, and we need to relook at this whole scenario, especially when they saw the cholesterol fall out. And he would have said, duh. I mean, he would have just gone, oh my God, right. So we'll go beyond heart disease briefly for this study. Hyperinsulinemic syndrome, the metabolic syndrome, is broader than you think. And it's not all heart disease. We've got to look at all the chronic disease. So these guys took a whole load of metabolic syndrome papers, which is insulin-resistant syndrome, but it's called metabolic. And they pulled out the ones that had actually measured insulin. right? They all should have, but they pulled out the ones where they had insulin. So how did insulin relate to this whole range of diseases I'm going to show you, where high insulin attached to the people with the diseases, not the people without? Well, there you go. 67 out of 70 studies, the insulin tracked with the diseased people versus none. And I'll let you just read that list there, right? That's a lot bigger than heart disease. And remember that for heart disease, LDL may weakly link to heart disease, but LDL doesn't do anything for all the others. So you can get an idea of the scale of what we're talking about here. And what really annoys me is, and Jeff showed this slide earlier, latest data, 65% approx of adults over 45 in the US are now essentially diabetic. They're hyperinsulinic, insulin resistant. You can call it what you like. And we reckon if you used insulin measures, very careful ones, maybe 75% of this adult population shares this common pathology or disease state, which is extraordinary. It's quite shocking. And here's a photo taken in Hungary 2 months ago at a conference where you can probably see the way I feel about this, right? Genuinely. And Fahad from Keto Geeks, a great guy, he does a bit of Photoshop, so he put this next picture out on Twitter and enhanced it, to make it more reflect my true feelings. Yeah, thanks, Fahad. So, we'll keep moving. We'll do a little bit on primary causes now. And here I will have to credit, for sure, Gabor Erdoshi. I interviewed him. You can see the picture here. I have a few interviews from Budapest in Hungary that are free on the web or on my YouTube channel, and very revealing. And Gabor is brilliant. He has thousands of research papers on file like I do. He shared some really good ones with me and gave me some great ideas and a bit of mentoring. So Gabor, a lot of his slides will show up here. And the question is, have you got safe fat or sick fat? And this has been touched on earlier. I think Jeff went through it, but a quick reminder. So basically, you can have subcutaneous adipose tissue with no inflammation, with nice small cell size, and that's safe fat, and that protects you. It acts as a buffer, and it makes your system work well. Or you can have sick fat, which is usually visceral adipose tissue, and often inflamed, which the red dots signify. And there's a big difference. And in an MRI, you can kind of look at what you got. You've basically got the subcutaneous fat around your periphery here, buttocks, legs. This is safe subcutaneous. And the visceral fat is seen on this scan in and around your organs, right? 4 types of people. The first one is metabolically healthy normal weight. And here, essentially, they've got healthy subcutaneous adipose tissue, and you can visualize it as a shield that if you do eat bad food or excessive food occasionally, it shields your liver and your systemic physiology from the effects of problematic things. It's a healthy buffer. And these people are insulin sensitive with really low risk. The guys that Jeff earlier said we should all be jealous of. Yeah, rightly so. Metabolically obese normal weight, the TOFIs, and here they've got extended or subcutaneous adipose tissue, but they don't really have much. They don't look fat. They've developed visceral adipose tissue as the second shield, and they've got inflammation in the adipose tissue. And here, a way to view it is, when they eat bad food or excessive food, the bullets get through to the liver. They're not being shielded, and they get systemic insulin resistance, and these guys are high risk. They may not be obese, they're high risk. The classic metabolically unhealthy obese have a lot of subcutaneous, and they have a lot of visceral, and they're inflamed, and they're high risk. But they would perceive themselves as high risk by being very obese, so at least they kind of are more aware of potential risk. And the interesting guys, the metabolically healthy obese, and these are fascinating. They've got healthy subcutaneous, not too much visceral, their fat's working well, and they've been able to create new adipocytes and expand their fat while keeping the cell size small and keeping it functional. And they protect their liver, and they are not systemically insulin resistant. So they are actually low risk. Now, they'll have more of a tendency in the future to become metabolically deranged than the slim person, but they are low risk right now. Myself and David Bobbitt, my boss, are particularly focused on these guys. And the reason is these are the guys who are not very overweight, don't perceive they're at risk, they don't smoke maybe, and they think they're fine. And the blood tests don't show them up as being at risk. And when they have a sudden heart attack at 54 and leave 3 children behind, everyone pulls their hair out and says, but they went jogging, they didn't smoke, they weren't overweight. But no one measured the measures that matter. That's what really kills us. Really does. And there's around 50 million in that bucket, going from Lustig's approximate figures, you know. It's a lot of people. And multiply it up by the world, you're talking a lot of people. So why? Why does the fat go bad? And I'm going to bring it through one causal chain which relates to carbohydrate and processing of carbohydrate. There are many more, but we'll go through one in detail, especially with the benefit of Gabor's work. We're going to be talking about the gut as being ground zero, and I hasten to say we are not talking about microbiome. I know that's very trendy, but we're talking about the hormonal signaling in the gut and crosstalk with all the organs in the body and the brain. We're more fundamental than the microbiome. And here we've got a little drawing of your stomach, a rather rude-looking pancreas, I must say. And that's not my drawing. I took that. And up high in your small intestine, you've got K cells, and the K cells release GIP, so glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide. And this is a powerful hormone that actually, when you eat, it's one of the big reasons your insulin rises, because it signals. It signals to drive up insulin based on what you eat, and it also speaks this hormone to adipose tissue to get ready for storage. It even speaks to bone and has functions there, not fully understood. So it's amazing stuff. GIP. Down further in your intestine, for the food that makes it down further, it can excite the L cells, which release GLP-1. I won't even name it, there's no need, but GLP-1 and PYY. And these are more beneficial hormones. You can see them as positive things to excite. Right? And the reason is that they enhance pancreatic function and they lead to satiety, particularly polypeptide YY, speaking to the brain. So these are kind of good things, you know, you kind of want them up. What happens when you eat this kind of crap, okay? Your classic SAD stuff, refined carbohydrates. Well, what happens is they generally cause an explosive rise in GIP and they drive up insulin and they get ready for adipose storage. So not things you'd particularly want. What happens to this kind of bad food when it moves down your intestine? Well, there's a tendency for these flash fire foods to not really go down your intestine all the way and do much action down here. So unfortunately, you don't really get a whole lot of GLP-1 and PYY activity. So you don't really get pancreatic function enhanced and satiety, right? So that's not good. And essentially, you've got a double whammy here. You've got 2 bad things. So the ratio is really bad for this junk food. What happens if you eat good stuff? I favor low carb, you know, healthy fats, high nutrient dense food. If you're going to eat carbohydrate plant foods, unprocessed above ground vegetables, you guys know the drill. Well, what tends to happen is you don't particularly excite GIP, so you have less insulin increase and less adipose storage. That's cool. But double whammy, these foods tend to pass deeper into your intestine and excite the L cells, and you get a boost in GLP-1 and PYY. So you get a double whammy in a good way. You can see the switch now, you know, double whammy bad versus double whammy good. Diet is hugely influential. And one thing that illustrates this is gastric bypass surgery. So I've showed you that little system there with the not so good K and the good L cells. But the most successful bypass surgery is Roux-en-Y, and one reason is it bypasses the K cells. It makes the stomach smaller, sure, but it bypasses the... Oh. I was just trying to think there, have I memorized the rest of this talk? Maybe not. So anyway, if you and there's a little more rudeness there as well. Okay, so it directs the food straight down to the L cells. So you can imagine this would have a beneficial effect. And it does. It lowers GIP and it increases the good guys, as well as reducing calories in fairness. But the interesting thing is the blood glucose controls in diabetic people comes back under control way before significant weight loss. Within days, their blood glucose is being re-regulated. And the diabetic ratios are actually resolved way before any weight loss. So it's kind of a proof point to illustrate. Now, we don't want to cut our stomachs open, right, to try and help ourselves. So what about diet? What can it do? Well, here's an experiment with kind of a plant-based diet. Not vegetarian, but in fairness, it's plant-based, so I'm not all carnivore kind of stuff. And we can see that the diet here, the paleo-type diets that were relatively plant-based compared to control nominal diet, you can see a massive reduction in postprandial GIP. So diet can have an enormous effect here, right? And the two diets were quite different, but they were both good. And you can see what happened. The PYY, the kind of satiety hormone and the positive hormone, is massively increased after the meal with the paleo compared to control, which is complete rubbish, right? So you can see the dramatic impact. And essentially this diet mimics the surgery effect, but without the knife. And what is the primary factor in the diets? What's so different? And it relates to their carbohydrate, not their fat or protein. And I'll show you now. The processing of starches, the processing of carbohydrate plant foods is the big problem. If you process natural fats or proteins, it doesn't change their inherent properties too much in the body. But carbohydrates, yes. And you see we make this kind of stuff, right, which goes nowhere good. However, I would say that breads are not a whole lot better than these things, right, and are a cornerstone of some of our problems. So we look here at a few quickie studies, and this one is bad apples. So here they got apples and they had them pureed or juiced or in the natural form. And if you look at the people's blood glucose after eating the various forms and having them fast or slow, you'll see that there's not much difference in the blood glucose rise. So you'd say, hey, what's to see here? Let's move on. Unless you kept tracking their glucose for another hour. And now you can see the hypoglycemia swing down to low blood glucose with the more processed apples, right? And Lustig has kind of referred to this kind of effect too. This is a nice study though. If you had looked at their insulin, you would have seen straight away. And the problem is the hyper-GIP and insulin response. So that illustrates. Now we've got worrying wheat. Now this wheat here, whole grains, I'm not too happy with the amount of insulin coming out of this puppy in the first place. But you can certainly see how bad it is to mechanically grind the wheat. And it makes the starch much more available, flash digestion, excites GIP, racks up insulin and blood glucose, right? That is not good. And here's just the area under the curve. You can see the more you mechanically grind, the worse it gets. Ruinous rice, perhaps not too bad. These are forms of rice that are not too bad in insulin release. And these forms here, with insulin, these are really bad. What's the difference? Well, these are white and brown rice, not much difference between them. And these are the same thing, just ground up mechanically, right? So mechanical grinding has a huge effect and maybe a cornerstone of our processing problem. Refined mice. This is kind of a pretty mouse, it's my kind of mouse. Well, does refined carb make refined mice? Or more like fat mice? So this study is very nice. I'll show you this one. You'll enjoy this one. So basically, they fed the mice ad lib either standard chow pellets, which are mostly carbohydrate, that's their natural diet, or they fed them what they always feed them in high-fat mice experiments. It's actually sugar and fat. It's always sugar and fat. They call it high-fat, but it's sugar and fat bomb. And of course, it blows up their bodies and it blows up their liver. Either a Western or a really high-fat with tons of sugar. So we're not too surprised at that. But what happens when they just ground up each diet? They didn't change anything. They just ground up the chow pellets here. Do you think it made them worse and made the mice a little fatter? A bit like the horror diets? Well, yeah, it sure did. Basically, the ground up carb became as bad as the worst diets that humans can make for mice. All the lines pretty much went together in this study. And the team actually looked and said, yeah, it's the cellular structure mechanically ground up that caused the problem, right? So, last one, and I'm going to speed through it. It's just different breads with less processing means less GIP, less insulin release under the curve. What did this team find? Was it the fiber that was the effect? Was it the grinding of the carb, just mechanically disrupting the cellular structure? Or was it the gastric emptying effect? Some people go on about this, slow food and all that. Well, anyway, it was all the grinding of the carb. The fiber is irrelevant. The fiber being low is just a proxy for the amount of processing. It's not really the fiber that makes the difference. And this is the final slide on this, and this is Gabor's favorite, and I agree with him. You can see that in a Petri dish or in a test tube in the lab, if you take any starch that a human's going to eat, right, and you put it in a test tube, and you put in amylase or enzymes that break the starch and glucose down into simple sugars, it correlates exactly with the blood glucose rise you're going to get in a human and the blood insulin rise. So you can tell in a lab with the starch how quickly it hydrolyzes, what it's going to do in a human, and it obviously has a huge effect. And for insulin release, this laboratory test has a 0.95 line up with the insulin release in a human. So you can pretty much tell, and it's based on how quick the starch can be broken into simple glucose, largely. Don't even start me on this stuff. We don't have time today. But right there we talk through the refining of starches and carbohydrate effects. Of course there are more causes, and this is a huge problem here, but we won't go into it. I'll show a brief root cause diagram though, just to show the overall picture. Blood clotting and endothelial damage and inflammation is the core of vascular damage that leads to atherosclerosis, heart disease, and death. That's our problem. In the root cause diagram, we're saying excess glucose and certainly fructose is one driver, especially from refined carb. This drives and causes through many mechanistic pathways systemic hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, starting with adipocyte hypertrophy, swollen fat cells, right down to the atherogenic dyslipidemia that the lipidologists love. But most of the cholesterol dyslipidemia is actually a function of insulin resistance syndrome. It's not really independent. There are, of course, other drivers that directly drive heart disease, like omega-3, omega-6 balance. We've got suboptimum magnesium and many more. We can't get into them here. But what's interesting to me over the years is that many of these other causes in turn actually drive up insulin and insulin resistance. So endotoxins in your blood trigger your immune system and drive up insulin. Smoking drives up insulin through the oxidation of lipoproteins, and it drives up insulin. So long story short, the insulin measurements not only reflect one of the biggest drivers of disease in the world, they also reflect other bad things that you're doing indirectly. So they act as an amazing gauge. So insulin should be measured all over the place. In an engineering world, it would. In our world, it's hard to get it measured at all, which is crazy. Pareto would have been all over this like a rash, as we say in Ireland, but there you go. So, primary solutions, and we'll tail in, we'll let you get to the bar. So here we keep things simple. What are some of the top Pareto items? We call it rack stack Pareto. You pick the big things and you do those because no one can do every good thing. You know, there's a million good things you can do. But if you pull out some big ones, low carb, healthy fats to make sure you don't have excess glucose if you're diabetic, even if it's complex carb, or refined carb for anyone, right? Healthy, low carb, beautiful solution to that. No breads, no processed foods. That's crazy. And there are mechanisms for all of this. Second one is suboptimum omega-3 or excessive omega-6, often coming in the form of vegetable oils. Just eat fatty fish. If you don't like fish, you can take cod liver oil a la Weston Price. You know, doesn't taste great, but you can just chuck it down. Only takes a second. Every couple of days, you know, tablespoon. And it brings a lot of vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins as well. You don't do vegetable oils, of course, and you don't do processed food because it's stuffed with refined carb and vegetable oils, invariably. Suboptimum magnesium I'll pick out as probably a very large one. You eat magnesium-rich foods. They're not as common as they used to be. You can buy magnesium citrate in bulk, and we mix it with the family's meals, like, bolognese and sauces. So all 5 children and myself and my wife all get magnesium without even noticing. It's a great way to do it. And processed food, sugars, and excessive alcohol can deplete you of magnesium. So you got to watch that stuff. Biochemical basics for that. The science is all there. Lack of vitamin D, lack of nitric oxide generated, lack of vasodilation, lack of sun exposure we evolved in. That can be a problem. So you can get healthy sun with no burning. You can use a lamp. There's a FDA-regulated Sperti lamp to get the benefits of the sun and UV. You can use supplements, which may not give you all the benefits of the sun, but if you're insufficient, it's a good idea. You don't burn, that's where the risk lies. Burning is stupid. And you don't eat processed foods because there's a lot of evidence building that vegetable oils, particularly in the diet, which we've gone overload on in this century, can cause cellular susceptibility to sun damage. So actually what you eat can affect how healthily you can have the sun. 1,000 years ago, people could have got a lot more sun without any problem. Keto, of course, and fasting are major artillery. Hugely beneficial, particularly for people with intransigent or significant disease, diabetes, or other issues. Keto can be a real lifesaver. And fasting, it's fantastic. On so many levels I don't have time to talk about. And you move on down the Pareto, depending on how strong your desire is to live for your children, your grandchildren, to be vibrant, to be healthy, to have mental acuity, to enjoy life, age gracefully. That's your choice. You can fix a lot more things, which we can't go through today. So bottom line, and we're out of here. Oh, okay, I'm kind of instinctively moving it along. Okay. Well, maybe we can do some Q&A if you really want to stay here with me. So middle-aged, middle risk, right? That's what we're talking about generally. What do? You're not sure of your health. You have some blood markers that are middle risk, but you don't know what's going on. You want definitive answers or close to definitive. Nothing's perfect. You get a calcium scan. It's the best test you can get for future mortality or heart disease. But the future can be changed. That's key to remember. You get a low score, keep taking blood tests, keep an eye on blood tests. Certainly don't ignore things like that because something odd might turn up. You follow the rules, as I outlined, or pick your personal Pareto as to what you think can keep you very healthy, okay? And maybe 5 or 7 years later, get a quick scan because you want to check that you haven't fallen off the wagon or nothing's gone wrong. So maybe even 10 years if you want. Quick check. No problem. You get a high score, like David, or up in the hundreds, or high for your age. That's a different deal, very different deal. You're now going to have to look very closely at a range of blood measures that I won't go into detail here, because you may have special causes. You need to find for you, are you very high homocysteine? Have you got heavy metal contamination? Is it just that you are basically drinking 4 pints of Coke a day and eating pizzas all day for the last 30 years. Then there's not too much surprise. Maybe you were smoking a pack a day. But what if you were like David, running, slim, and not smoking? You're going to have to scrutinize these puppies, and get the right advice to interpret them, for sure. With a high score, it may be appropriate to get medications to stabilize plaque and give you some stability as you try and work through this problem. Okay, it may be appropriate, though Nadir's talk there has me shrinking from this one. But no, in fairness, there's various medications with various merits, so that's certainly something to consider. And you will certainly want to follow a new set of Pareto rules, right? And you're going to have to find out the ones that are the top 20% for you that let you get into this state. But if you do those, you can stop the calcification progressing. And it's important to realize that calcification is a progressive process. Atherosclerosis is a chronic progressive disease. Your calcification will generally go up if you don't do anything 20 or 30% a year, and this is documented. But the orthodoxy views this as an inevitability. With age and life, calcification will increase with atherosclerosis, inevitably. There are papers titled The Inevitable Mathematical Progression of Calcification, but it's actually a lie, because we know now, and we have many people doing it, and some published papers that show if you intervene with the right interventions, you can take 1,000 score, and rather than going up to 1,250 and then 1,500 in the following years, you can have it go 1,000, 1,040, 1,060, and you can stop the calcification or even regress it. But if you stop the calcification, it's the canary in the coal mine that tells you, wow, you've been successful. You have stopped the progressive disease of atherosclerosis, and the calcification has stopped growing. And if you do that, the data would suggest your risk begins to plummet down to someone who never had a high score in the first place, which is huge. And it's not appreciated, I think, in the orthodoxy that this can be done. Right? But it can, and in the coming 10 years, this is going to more and more become apparent, and more people can be saved. You may want to move down the Pareto. If you've got a high score, you're not one to leave many stones unturned, right? It's your life. No one's going to do it for you. Sadly, your doctor probably can't do much more than give you some meds, right? Only you, with the help of any experts you can get, can interpret your scenario and get all of your key factors fixed. Sadly, it's up to you. Like David had to do it for himself. And he's a management accountant and one of Ireland's most successful entrepreneurs, but he is not a technical person. He delegates that. But he had to personally go after this. And by God, he worked it out too. If you have a high score, in fairness, a couple of years later, you're going to want to check in, because you're not like someone down here with a 0. You're going to want to check in a couple of years and say, okay, I was 9.010 or 9.10. You want to see I'm only around 940 or 50 now. If you go back in a couple of years and you say, oh, I'm 1,300, right, you're going to have to reassess what you're doing, maybe dig a little deeper. But generally, if you do all the right stuff, you'll generally find you won't have a shock result in 2 years. And anyway, you're doing the right thing for you, your family, and your grandchildren, right? You're going to be around for them, because you're going to take your own leadership here over your own life, and that's important. And the tragedy nowadays is people don't get a chance to take leadership of their own life because they don't know what to do. I mean, that's so frustrating, you know? It's not they don't want to save their own life and live 15 years longer with a way better quality of life. Of course they want to, but they're being fed absolute junk science by most authorities, and it's frustrating. Okay, let that go before I lose my temper. So if you did this, right, and if you did this and you did proper science, you followed your markers, you grew to understand them, you got the right advice, you took the measures that stop atherosclerosis in its tracks, and you get either a 0 score maintained for a long time or a high score that you slow the progress down and bring your risk right back down, right? And if you do all the right things in the list, you're certainly following Pareto, and he'd love you for it, and rightly so. But what if you want to drink your vegetable oils because some idiots told you they were good for you? What if you don't get a scan because the heart associations don't like the scan for political and other reasons? Okay? What if you want to eat healthy whole grains because Ansell or some other bumpkins years ago got it all mixed up? What if you want to follow? Well, who are you following then? Well, I think we met him earlier, didn't we? Thank you. I think that's it.